Well, thank you all for being here. I want to especially thank Dr. Weihnacht and Professor Lee for all the effort they put into this series of talks. I wanted to speak about biometrics and ultrasonics, and I wanted to find something that naturally fit the two together. And I think if you go back to Francis Galton in the late 1800s, you find a nexus between the two. And so I thought, well, maybe I'll talk about that today. I think that would be fairly interesting. There is a Galton collection at the University College London, which I visited fairly recently. The curator of that collection is Subhadra Das. If you are in London, downtown London, I highly recommend that you go and visit Ms. Das. Make an appointment to see her on a Thursday when she opens up the Galton collection. They have a website that I put here, and many of the images that I'm going to show you I got directly from her in the Galton collection. Well, who was Francis Galton? He lived throughout the 19th century. He was the grandson of Erasmus Galton. Erasmus Galton was the grandfather of Charles Darwin. The difference between Darwin and Galton is they had different grandmothers. Charles Darwin was the result of the first wife of Erasmus Darwin, and Francis Galton's grandmother was the second wife of Erasmus Galton, so that was the difference between the two. Francis Galton was educated in math at Cambridge. He founded an anthropometrics laboratory at what was called the South Kensington Museum in 1888. Now, the South Kensington Museum is today known as the Victoria and Albert Museum. That's a very wonderful science museum not far from the University College London. Again, well worth your time visiting if you are in London. He mentored Carl Pearson. Carl Pearson was the father of Egon Pearson, and there's a close connection with Ronald Fisher. Now, if you studied any statistics in graduate school, you have studied the work of all of these five people, starting with Francis Galton. Francis Galton developed the concept of a correlation or correlation coefficient. Carl Pearson developed chi-square analysis, for example. His son, Egon Pearson, you know very well for hypothesis testing, the Neyman-Pearson hypothesis testing. They were both professors of eugenics at the University of College London, a program that was founded, in fact, by Francis Galton. And the final professor of eugenics, and the department has since become the Department of Genetics, was, of course, Ronald Fisher. Ronald Fisher, I don't believe would have ever met Francis Galton because he was a bit too young, I suspect. It's possible they could have met. Ronald Fisher, you know, developed the F-test and developed analysis for variance. The point I'm trying to make here is all of this whole package of British statistics that we study today in graduate school that forms the entire curriculum, in fact, of our first year of graduate school statistical study, was in fact directly linked to Francis Galton and the early work he did, including some work in principal component analysis. He wrote a paper in Nature in 1888 called Personal Identification and Description, in which he advocated for the use of fingerprinting, and he coined the term eugenics. Now, you know, I think, the history of eugenics, a very sad history of eugenics. What's interesting to me is I took biology in the 1960s from a high school teacher that himself was educated in the 30s, and even as late as the 1960s, we were educated very much in the concepts of eugenics, the importance of cleansing the gene pool, of making sure that the gene pool of people remained pure and clean so that bad genes didn't enter the general population. This, of course, has been widely discredited. We no longer talk in these terms, but it's interesting to me that as late as the mid-1960s, I was educated in eugenics. Francis Galton founded the Eugenics Society, but the chair of eugenics at University College London is now called the chair of genetics. Galton also founded the journal Biometrica. There are 3 journals currently using the name Biometrics in some way. There's the British journal Biometrica. There's founded by Francis Galton, in fact, and Carl Pearson. There's the British journal Biometrics that was founded by Ronald Fisher, and there is a new journal, again another British journal, called the IET. This is the Institution of Engineering and Technology Biometrics Journal. So there are 3 journals of biometrics, but they're interested in different aspects of biometrics, as we'll see. Now, Francis Galton did some early work in perceptual ultrasonics. He, of course, didn't invent ultrasonics, but he was interested in human perception, and he invented what we would call a dog whistle. And I think this a statement here is kind of interesting. It's from a book that's available online, very famous book written by Francis Galton called Inquiries into Human Faculty and Development, 1883. And here he explains this whistle that he developed and why he developed it to ascertain the upper limits of audible sound in different persons. That is, that would be the lower limits of ultrasonics as we define it, but the upper limits of what the human ear can hear. He had a brass tube, and I'll show you a picture on the next slide, internal diameter less than 1/10 of an inch, and a plug was pulled in and out of the lower end of the tube, just like a slide whistle, to allow adjustment of the frequency. So the second bullet here I think is interesting because it gives insight into Francis Galton's personality. Oh, this is amazing. He says, "It is only too amusing experiment to test a party of persons of various ages, including some rather elderly and self-satisfied personages. They are indignant at being thought deficient in the power of hearing." So this is a very interesting party game if you are a bit perverse. You take one of these whistles into a party and you show all the old people like me that the upper limits of our hearing have significantly deteriorated compared to those of younger years. This is a very odd party game. He credits Lord Rayleigh with coming up with some of the physical acoustic work in ultrasonics. And this is really what differentiates Francis Galton. He was interested in perception. He was primarily an anthropologist. He was interested in human beings, and how human beings responded to things. Here's a picture of his whistle as it exists now in the Galton collection at the University of College London. It has been torn apart. And if you see this tube stretching down through here, he didn't actually blow into the whistle. He had a little handheld pump, and as he walked along with his walking cane, he would push the handheld pump to see which response he would get. He loved to take this whistle to the London Zoo and to see what animals would respond. He found that lions responded very well. He noted that cats seemed to have the highest frequency hearing ability of all the animals he tested. So this is how the whistle sits now in the University College London. He wrote a very influential book called Fingerprints in 1892. Now, he was certainly not the first person to bring the concept of fingerprinting to our attention. There were 2 papers published in 1882 in Nature on the fundamental concept of fingerprinting as a method of recognizing human beings. But he got involved in his anthropometric lab in London in measuring the fingerprints of anybody who came through the system and trying to correlate those fingerprints with personality characteristics, with things like race, with things like gender, with things like age. And he says here, now, there are no indications of temperament or character or ability to be found in finger marks, as far as I've been able to discover. This was based on very, very, very broad experimentation. This is the one thing that Francis Galton excelled in, and that is in the collection of data. But he said there can be no doubt that the evidential value of identity afforded by prints of 2 or 3 fingers is so great as to render it superfluous to seek confirmation from other sources. Now, here is Galton's definition of biometrics. I mentioned that he founded the journal Biometrica, and in the very first issue of the first volume, he gives this definition of biometrics: the application to biology of the modern methods of statistics. Well, the word biometrics is used in a different method by some groups today, certainly not all groups, and this is very contentious. The biologists do not like the fact that, and the word they use is hijacked, that the word biometrics has been hijacked by some in the security community. This is a definition in a current ISO document, International Organization of Standards. This definition was contributed to largely by the Germans and the British and the French. The German representation on the International Committee comes largely from the Fraunhofer Institute in Darmstadt. And this is a definition of biometrics that's currently used in this international standard, and that is the automated recognition of individuals based on their biological and behavioral characteristics. So there's been a split in the community where the traditional biologists that still make statistical measurements on biological materials in general use the term biometrics to mean any type of application of statistics to biological materials. And then there's a group in the security and computer world that uses the term biometrics to mean the automated recognition of individuals. I want to add that biometrics in this sense really doesn't involve any biology. It involves pattern recognition. And it really is not anthropometry, although fingerprinting would be the exception. There is this mythology in the common press that when we do facial recognition, we're somehow measuring distances between eyes and nose. Nothing could be farther from the truth. These are pattern recognition algorithms that are used to recognize relationship between images that have nothing to do with anthropometry. I'm going to show you a little bit about fingerprinting. Fingerprinting is an exception here to biometric methods. It actually is an anthropometric method, as I'll explain in a minute. And biometrics in this sense is not identity. I want to differentiate between those two things on this slide here. Recognize means to know again. I'm going to realize that you are the same person I saw or I measured or I imaged yesterday. But identity is a list of attributes. Now remember what Galton said. Galton said he could not find anything about temperament or personality or race in fingerprints. These are identity attributes, and they simply aren't present in any biometric methodology. I can show you my fingerprints, but you'll know nothing about me in terms of my citizenship, in terms of my age, in terms of my personality, my temperament. Any of the things that you think would correspond to my identity are not visible at all in my fingerprints. Now, there is perhaps in facial recognition an exception to this. People have suggested that facial recognition can reveal such things as gender, age, and race. That may be true. But in other types of human recognition technologies, it is not true that any personal characteristics beyond the image themselves can be revealed through these methodologies. So biometric technologies can connect bodies to a list of attributes that have been discovered through other means. For instance, if you discover that I'm a US citizen and I give you my fingerprints, you can then connect this body on future occurrences with the fact that I'm a US citizen. Coming here to Taiwan, I had to give 2 index fingerprints, right? That didn't reveal anything about my identity, but presumably immigration connected those 2 index fingerprints to my passport and my passport number. So in the future, when they see these 2 index fingers, they can connect me to the passport, which is not related to my biometrics, to determine that I'm a US citizen, right? So consequently, biometrics can be used to enforce a one individual, one identity record policy. If I was ever to come back to Taiwan carrying a passport belonging to someone else, the disparity between the two would be immediately recognized. These fingerprints would connect me to the old passport, and immigration here in Taiwan could say, wait a minute, something is wrong. We've previously connected these fingerprints to a passport that said James Wayman, who was an American, and now we're connecting the fingerprints to someone else. So biometrics are technologies for recognizing individuals. In this particular case, an individual is considered to be a human body. I underlined in the next bullet point, I said recognize by inspecting your body and its behaviors. I wanted to do that because I want to personalize this. Many people don't like this idea of automated recognition through bodily inspection. What? Someone is going to inspect my body to link me to records? Some people find this offensive, and I understand why. Many people don't want their bodies to be personally and closely inspected to link to identity records that have been obtained through other methods. There are many commercially available technologies for recognizing individuals. I've written a few, all the ones I know currently down here: fingerprint, iris, face, hand shape, voice, finger vein. There are a couple of lesser known technologies that might be commercially available. For instance, keystroke, typing on a keyboard, how you use the keystroke. Many people still talk about retinal scanning. Retinal scanning is not commercially available. It has not been commercially available for about 20 years, but it was very popular about 20 or 30 years ago. Well, I want to focus this talk on fingerprinting, and I want to tell you a little bit about fingerprinting here with this slide. Fingerprints, actually the friction ridges on your fingers. In English, we call these Galton ridges very often. That's the pieces of the skin. The friction ridges or Galton ridges on the skin are about 300 to 500 micrometers wide. They connect the pores in the finger of the skin, so the pores lie right across the ridges of the skin. The valleys are about 50 to 100 micrometers thick, and they're about 1/3 of the thickness of the ridges. Here I have a cartoon drawing of a ridge and valley combination. Francis Galton was the person that characterized these ridges as having endings and bifurcations, bifurcations where the ridges split. This is in fact how we identify fingerprints today, by the location of the ridges endings and the ridge bifurcations. There are standards for fingerprint scanners. There are 2 de facto international standards that actually are US standards. But when I say de facto international standards, I mean these standards are used everywhere, including here in Taiwan. The standards for fingerprint scanners are this AFIS Image Quality Specification for Scanners Appendix F, which requires 500 pixels per inch. That is about 50 micrometers per pixel. That's going to be important in what I talk about here in a minute. And also it requires an 8-bit gray scale for imaging pixels. That means that a black pixel will be 0 and a white pixel will be 255. But there has to be the capability of imaging all values of grayscale between 0 and 255. This has been a serious problem for some types of technologies. And so there is also this US standard called the Personal Identification and Verification Standard, PIV 071006, that was adopted about 5 or 6 years ago for other types of fingerprint scanners that cannot meet the Appendix F requirements. I want to show you a few fingerprints here so that you can see that fingerprinting is not perhaps as easy as you thought it might be. On the far left is a senior citizen, and that's defined in this particular study that I did as anyone over 55. People over 55 had decidedly worse fingerprints than college students. And the next slide over is that of a college student, and the next slide over here is one of my children. I'm not exactly sure which one of my children that is. And then on the far right, not to scale, are some recent images I received from Anil Jain. There has been considerable interest lately in the fingerprinting of newborns. And this raises some real problems because a newborn has as many fingerprint ridges on its finger as an adult does, but of course the fingers are so much smaller. It requires higher resolution imagery. And the statistics I gave you, that 300 to 500 micrometer ridge width, is certainly not true of infants. This is a brand new area. We're just working on it now. Fingerprinting of infants and developing the appropriate technologies for doing that, because it requires extremely high resolution scanning. Well, there are some issues with fingerprints. Fingerprints are not like they show you in the movies. A fingerprint is a print of the friction ridge patterns on the end of your finger. And up here is some fingerprints that I collected in a study I did in the Philippines. They are the very same finger of the very same person imaged at a period of 6 weeks. And you can see those 2 fingerprints are really quite different, despite the fact that they come from the very same finger of the very same person. Friction ridges are very fragile, and they're easily damaged. And so that's what you have. What is the distinctiveness of a fingerprint? Well, there was a very famous case about 3 or 4 years ago in the United States where a lawyer from Oregon was mistaken for a terrorist in Spain and was put in prison for 2 weeks and ultimately given $2 million by the FBI for their mistake. On the left is a fingerprint from a plastic bag used in a terrorist bombing at the Madrid train station that was unfortunately connected here with Brandon Mayfield on the far right, when in fact the fingerprint was from Ohani Daoud in the middle. We don't have a good understanding of the distinctiveness of fingerprints, and particularly when there are very low quality images that we're trying to match. That low quality image matches very, very nicely against these two images of these two different people. And so fingerprint mistakes are in fact known. And you can see why, given the within class variability, the variability of a single fingerprint, that masked or confused the between class difference between Daoud and Mayfield. So how do we image these fingerprints? Well, there's several technologies currently available to us. We have optical technologies, and among those are visible and IR light. What's become very, very popular in the last 2 or 3 years is contactless fingerprinting, fingerprinting that doesn't require you to touch any surface. In fact, there's an application for your smartphone that allows you to take a picture of your fingerprint and unlock the phone, not requiring any direct contact. Both coherent and incoherent light is used in these optical systems. Capacitive fingerprint scanners have been quite popular in the last 10 years. Thermal fingerprint scanners are no longer popular. Piezoelectric fingerprint scanners were all the rage about 15 years ago. But lastly, and I've got this highlighted, is ultrasonic scanners, because that's been the primary application of ultrasonics to biometrics, if we're meaning biometrics in the sense of automated recognition technologies. The primary application of ultrasonics to biometrics has been in ultrasonic fingerprint sensors. Now, some fundamental principles here. We have the essential, very straightforward acoustic reflection equation. Here, and you'll find this equation in all of the papers that I looked at least, on ultrasonic fingerprinting. Z here is called the impedance. Now, my background in acoustics was always in looking at phase differences. And so I was a little bit surprised to find that these articles all refer to impedance as a real quantity. I prefer, of course, impedance as a complex quantity. So I want to annotate that when these papers use the word Z, they're using it as a real quantity, meaning the magnitude of the complex reflection coefficient. And so the first equation there simply gives a reflection across two surfaces. And if the magnitude of the complex impedance is equal to the product of the density times the phase velocity, then you can plug in some values for the density of skin and the phase velocity of skin, and the density of air and the phase velocity of air. And then a polystyrene can be used as a substrate because its density is about that of human flesh. And you can come up very easily with these reflection coefficients of about 23% when a finger ridge sits on a polystyrene substrate, and about a 99.97 or 100% reflection when a fingerprint valley sits on a polystyrene substrate. So you can see that if we were to measure the reflection coefficient, we could tell very easily the difference between a ridge and a valley when placed against a flat polystyrene substrate. And that's the principle upon which these systems work. Again, some images from John Schneider, who has previously been quoted. He gives the following optical and acoustic images. He also shows that if you take a pen and you mark a fingerprint, the optical fingerprint reader is not much good, but the acoustic reader seems to do pretty well. One of the problems we have is that we do not have any extensive studies comparing optical fingerprinting to acoustic fingerprinting across a large population. There are no studies whatsoever. So we don't really know, but these are the claims that are being made about the various technologies. John Schneider gave a talk here at the International Ultrasonic Symposium in 2001 about this technology here, which is now owned by Qualcomm. And actually, it's a mechanically actuated technology that physically moves the acoustic system across the fingerprint. A scanning transducer geometry physically sweeps across the entire image area, results in a more complex, higher power motion control system, but minimizes overall transducer focal length and spot size. This particular technology uses 30 megahertz. And in his paper that was published in the Proceeding in 2001, he does a very simple analysis to show why 30 megahertz makes sense based on a 50 micrometer spot size. Again, that 50 micrometer comes from the FBI Appendix F standard of 500 pixels per inch. So that's where that comes from. Then the entire motion control system is immersed in acoustically conductive fluid, which in this case is low viscosity mineral oil. The oil creates little attenuation of the return signal and presents only modest drag on the probe arm. But there have been additional presentations here over the last 15 years on acoustic fingerprinting, ultrasonic imaging of fingerprint using acoustical impedance was given in 2004, and then in 2010 this 3D ultrasonic imaging of the human hand was presented here at this conference. There have been more publications, 2008, 2011 on the use of ultrasonic fingerprintings. And then of course the most recent was the one that you just heard. This has received quite a bit of attention in the media in the United States, the idea of this non-mechanical ultrasonic impedance fingerprint reflection. It's a very interesting system, and Stephanie did a good job of describing it. I don't know if she mentioned that in the original paper they were talking about a 22 megahertz piezoelectric system with a 100 micrometer pitch. I didn't fully understand the 100 micrometer pitch. That seems to indicate that the width is about twice what is expected in the Appendix F, if I'm interpreting this correctly. About twice what's expected in Appendix F, meaning that such a system could not be used to acquire fingerprints in large-scale systems employed around the world until that pitch size comes to be about half of that. And of course, it's accentuated with a 2-cycle square wave. One of the advantages claimed in the Fung paper is that ultrasonic pulse echo imaging has the potential to be more secure, as it allows images to be collected at various depths, providing spoof resistance. A very interesting paper on the history of fingerprint forgery is published in 1999. It's given here. Fingerprint forgeries can be traced all the way back to 1907. So there's an over 100-year history of fingerprint forgeries, and certainly people have been quite concerned about this. The James Bond movie, there's a new James Bond movie coming out on Friday. Did you hear this? So the James Bond movie, 1972, Diamonds Are Forever, includes a sequence in which James Bond puts little latex coverings on his finger and spoofs a fingerprint system. Very popular concept from the 1970s. Very nice work was done by Ton Vanderput, again a paper that's available online. He shows a whole variety of prints and plastic and latex methods of spoofing fingerprints. All right, so is there a market niche for ultrasonic fingerprint scanners? And there may very well be. That market niche, however, would require low cost, something under about $500 US. Would have to be Appendix F compliant, or at least that PIV compliant. It would require a 3-inch by 5-inch imaging area so that you could image 4 fingers at a time. Now, when I came in through immigration at the airport, I was only required to give 2 index fingers. But if you go in through immigration in the United States, you'll be required to give 4 index fingers. These are 4 fingers. These are called slapped fingers. And to have a market nowadays, you need to have enough area that you can get 4 fingers down on that. A nice part about acoustic scanning is there's no light emission. And law enforcement and military people have said this is very important, to have no light at all coming out of the systems. So I think that's a real advantage. These acoustic systems, I think, could be very low maintenance, and that would be a very, very good thing. And then the second possible use, however, would be to combine in some way optical technologies with acoustic technologies for the purpose of liveness detection, that is, preventing spoofing. I think there might be some hybrid technology that might be quite useful. Well, I want to conclude, I see I'm exactly on time, with the following couple of comments. First of all, Galton was right. that fingerprints do not reveal any identity attributes. You cannot tell anything about my personality. You can't tell anything about my gender. You can't tell anything about my citizenship by looking at my fingerprints. But, fingerprints are highly valuable for recognizing me, meaning that fingerprints can be used to enforce a one individual, one identity record policy. Finger imaging and fingerprint recognition is difficult. I think, as you've seen from the images that I showed you, false negatives are possible, false positives are possible. False negatives being very, very common, false positives not as common, but common nonetheless. All currently installed fingerprint images are either optical or capacitive, but I think there is a potential for ultrasonic fingerprint systems, particularly given the claimed advantages of better quality and spoofing detection. But then we have to think farther than that, and I just want to leave you all with this question, and that is, what other automated human recognition applications might be possible with ultrasonics? Are we limited in human recognition only to fingerprinting, or are there other forms of human recognition that might lend themselves very, very well to ultrasonic technologies? I'm going to leave you with that question as something to think about, because there may be a whole new market here for a whole new set of technologies based on ultrasonics. Thank you very much.